Her baby was born in the woods. She said, "I don't know what I'm doing." So why did the cowboy say I do? Before we begin, take a moment to comment your city. Where are you tuning in from tonight? And once the story is over, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. Now lean back, close your eyes, and enjoy the story. The Montana Territory. Autumn of 1876. The wind howled through the pine forest, echoing like some long cry from the faraway west. Across the sky, the sunset burned red, casting shadows down the rain-soaked trunks. Beneath one ancient pine, a single cry split the damp night, the cry of a newborn child. Joda Fallow, her dress soaked with rain, and blood held the baby close to her trembling chest. Her breath came in short, ragged bursts. Tears blurred her vision as she whispered through chattering lips, "I don't know what I'm doing." A branch cracked, hoofbeats pressed into the wet earth. Then out of the storm's curtain, a cowboy stepped forward, hat-dripping revolver at his side. His voice was low and steady. "I do." In that moment, despair and hope collided, changing two lives forever. The storm raged across Montana that night. Thunder rolled against the distant ranges, wind screamed across the desert flats, and in a small rail town nearby, the saloon doors groaned on their hinges. The wooden floorboards moaned beneath lonely footsteps. Inside, an oil lamp flickered weakly against rows of empty bottles. Outside, the main street lay scarred with mud and old hoofprints stretching toward the railroad that curved like a steel scar into the wilderness. There was no fiddle music, no laughter, only the rasp of wind against a rusted sign. But out beyond the timberline, the world was not silent. A newborn's cry rose again, fierce and fragile, daring the rain and the darkness. Joda Fallow clung to her child beneath the storm rain, and blood mingling on her torn dress. Her back pressed against the pine, her breath, ragged eyes wide as if pleading for anyone to find her. Along the muddy road into town rode a lone cowboy. His boots were dust-worn, his hat brim low, his eyes sharp as coals beneath the shadow. His name was Nolin Judson, 32 years old, a man who had driven cattle and broken horses from Texas clear to Wyoming. Folks said he spoke little, let his deeds do the talking. A drifter, yes, but the kind of man who never failed to offer his hand when someone had fallen. Up in the loft of that abandoned saloon, a window banged open wind, dragging it back and forth like the whisper of the Old West itself. And somewhere in that whisper, two fates began to draw together, a forsaken mother and a wandering cowboy. In the rain, Joda breathed the words again, "I don't know what I'm doing." And from the darkness, a cowboy's answer cut through two words that would alter the course of their lives, "I do." Part 1. The Hand. From the darkness, the Montana rain fell in sheets, each drop slicing the skin like a thin blade. Joda Fallow trembled beneath it, her dress heavy with water, her back pressed hard against the moss-dark trunk of a pine. In her arms, the newborn curled tight against the cold, its thin cry fading to a hoarse whimper. Joda knew, without fire, without shelter, the child would not live through the night. Then came another sound, the heavy rhythm of hooves slogging through the mud, the creak of saddle leather. Out of the storm's veil, a figure emerged, a wide-brimmed hat dripping a trail-worn coat clinging to broad shoulders. His eyes swept the clearing, then fixed on the woman and the child. "I won't bring you fear?" His voice was low, roughened by the storm, but gentle. He slipped the long wool coat from his back, still warm from his body, and draped it across her shoulders. Joda flinched, but the cold was too merciless to resist. The child stirred its breath, burning faintly against her chest. The man nodded. "My name's Nolan Judson, cowboy riding for Bozeman. Last night, I saw firelight. I knew someone out here needed help." Joda's voice broke into a sob. I don't know what I'm doing." His gaze never left her face. "I know. Let me help." In the wind and the dark woods, those words fell like a rope thrown to the drowning. Nolan sank to one knee, his bare hands open to show he meant safety, not harm. His gloves hung from his belt, his revolver flashing silver in the lightning. His hands trembled just slightly when they touched her wrist. "Can you stand?" he asked. She shook her head, tears sliding with the rain. He closed his hand around hers steady and firm, then moved to lift her frail weight. When she slumped against him, she could hear the thundering beat of his heart, the heart of a man unaccustomed to leaving others behind. He rigged a travois from pine boughs, and Rawhide laid a horse blanket across it and eased Joda down with the child clutched to her breast. His dark bay stallion snorted softly, then bent its neck to accept the trace line without protest. Step by steady step, Nolan led them through the sucking mud. He spoke only when the storm seemed ready to crush her will. "Hold on, the old cabin's just a mile ahead." Each word landed like a stake driven into the storm, giving her something to cling to. The Montana woods at night were a wet labyrinth. An owl cried. Branches snapped under iron hooves. Curled on the travois, Joda clung fiercely to the child, her eyelids heavy, her ears straining for each fragile breath. Ahead, the cowboy strode with unyielding strength, shoulders squared against the storm. Lightning tore the sky, carving his wet hair to a silver sheen. Perhaps a lifetime of drifting had hardened him, but still he turned his head back, his voice steady. "You're doing fine. So is the little one. This storm won't take you." Joda's lips parted. No one had spoken such words to her since the day her family cast her out. In the dark, that simple kindness burned like a small flame. At last, Nolan stopped. Through the rain loomed a cabin, its walls gray with age doors sagging from its hinges. To Joda, it looked like a castle. He lifted her down, keeping her steady, and pushed the door open. Damp wood and old ash met them, but in moments, he struck a spark from tinder he carried dry in his pouch. Fire sprang to life, casting gold light against the broken boards. Inside, he spread his heavy coat by the hearth and lowered her to the floor. The child's cries softened into a gentle breath, her skin warming pink in the glow. Nolan found an old iron pot, caught rainwater outside, and set it on the fire. Steam rose with the smoke. He peeled off his gloves and handed her a tin cup filled with warm water. "Drink. You need your strength." Her hands shook as she lifted it. He pressed no words, only sat quietly by the fire, eyes fixed on the flame. That silence, filled with his steady presence, cracked something inside her. She had never believed a stranger might treat her with such patience. The firelight revealed his face, a faint scar along his jaw, eyes the color of the earth, deep and steady. Not pity in them, no. The eyes of a man who had lost, who had suffered, and who still chose to stay. Night deepened. Rain hammered the roof, but inside the cabin, firelight danced against the splintered walls. Joda held Fern close, her baby's warmth seeping into her chest, until her heavy eyes began to close. She stirred once, sensing a shift. Nolan had drawn a ragged hide over mother and child, then taken his seat by the door, revolver within reach, eyes still open. A man long accustomed to guarding others through the night. In her drifting sleep, Joda whispered, "I don't know what I'm doing." And faint as the storm's breath, She almost heard the reply, "I do." That night, for the first time since her family cast her out, Joda did not feel entirely alone. And if you've ever known the feeling of someone staying awake just to keep your sleep safe, then you know hope always finds its way back. Part 2. The Fire in the Abandoned Cabin. The old cabin reeked of rotted wood and cold ashes. Its gray boards were cracked, the walls full of gaps. Joda sat against a torn heap of hides, clutching Fern close, feeling the child's faint breath warm against her skin. The cold still cut through in waves, setting her shoulders trembling. Nolan rummaged through a broken drawer until he found a rusted tin inside a handful of dry shavings. He crouched low, struck flint to steel. Sparks leapt, catching on a strip of bark, and then slowly, a flame bloomed. He cupped his hands, coaxed it to life, until fire leapt upward, painting his weathered face in restless light. The flame revealed every corner of the cabin, spiderwebs sagging, splinters curling from the beams, and Joda's exhausted, tearful eyes. Yet in that glow, fear seemed to shrink away. Fern stirred once, then sighed, her tiny hands uncurling, as if even she believed in the warmth. Joda's lips moved faintly. "Thank you." Nolan only nodded. His voice came rough, but steady. "This fire will see us through the night." As the heat began to spread, he stepped out to catch rainwater, then set an old iron pot above the flame. From his leather pouch, he drew what little he carried: a pinch of cornmeal, a scrap of smoked meat, a fist of salt worth near to gold. The broth boiled rich steam, filling the room, drowning out the smell of damp and mold. He poured it into a wooden bowl and placed it in Joda's trembling hands. She looked down at the rising steam, eyes burning. How long had it been since someone else cooked for her? "Eat," he said, simply turning away to busy himself with a whetstone and a long knife, as though giving her space. She tasted. Harsh salt, plain and thin, but tears broke anyway. Fern whimpered softly, and Joda bent, whispering into the baby's hair, "We'll be all right, you hear me? We'll be all right." From the corner, Nolan looked up. For just a moment, the sight fixed him, a worn mother's face, glowing as she soothed her child. His grip tightened on the knife handle. He knew a thin stew wouldn't fill them long, but tonight it could keep a spark alive. Rain drummed on the roof. Joda dozed lightly, only to jolt awake at the sound of dripping water. A dark leak had broken through, dripping close to where Fern lay. Nolan rose at once. Grabbing a horsehide, he climbed the roof in the downpour. Lightning cut the sky, and Joda saw his silhouette etched against it, shoulders braced hammer, rising and falling with swift, practiced force. When he came down, his coat was soaked through his body, shivering, but his eyes were calm. He tested the door frame, then said softly, "It'll hold now. The rain won't touch you or the baby." Joda sat still, her hand resting on Fern's blanket, a strange swell in her chest. For the first time in months, someone had cared for their safety. The bitterness of being cast out by her kin dimmed, replaced by something she hardly dared name: gentleness. The fire hissed and crackled, spreading its amber glow. Nolan leaned against a beam revolver, close at hand, eyes never straying far from her and the child. Her voice broke the silence, trembling. I left Helena because my sister turned me away. The baby's father said I lied. They called me a disgrace. I had nowhere left to go. The fire popped. He didn't speak at once. No questions, no pity. Only a slow nod, his voice low and solid. But you made it this far, and you're still holding your child. That's enough to tell me you're stronger than they'll ever know. She bit her lip, tears slipping free. For the first time since being cast aside, her words weren't silenced. Her pain wasn't judged. By the fire's glow, she realized she was no longer utterly alone. Outside, the storm softened. Inside, Fern slept deeply in her mother's arms, cheeks warm in the firelight. Joda laid her down on the hide, then turned her gaze toward the cowboy. Their eyes met. No words, just a single nod, carrying an unspoken promise. I'll keep watch. Nolan drew a heavy blanket over her, then stepped back to the door. He sat with his gun laid across his knees, the fire painting his face in steady lines. The face of a man who had chosen to stay in the darkness so someone else might rest in peace. Joda watched him for a moment, and something small but real lit within her, fragile but alive. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in a long while, she slept without dreaming of someone turning their back. Part 3. The past cast aside. Outside, wind moaned through the cracks of the roof, scattering the first snowflakes of the season in wild spirals. Inside, the fire had burned low, leaving only embers pulsing faintly in the hearth. Joda sat close, cradling Fern against her chest. Across the room, Nolan leaned back against a timber post, a small knife in his hand shaving curls from a block of wood. The blade gleamed in the glow of dying coals. She hesitated a long time before whispering almost to herself, "Do you know, I once had a family." Nolan didn't lift his head, but the knife paused, held still above the wood. A gust of wind pressed against the door, as though urging her to go on. "I had a sister," Joda said, swallowing hard. "She once promised she'd always be by my side, but when I returned with a child in my belly, the way she looked at me, it was as if I were a stranger. She told me I'd chosen my path, so I had to walk it alone. And then she shut the door." Her voice broke, trembling like ashes in the draft. Fern stirred her tiny hand, pressing against her mother's breast. Joda bent her face into her child's soft hair, tears falling silently. Nolan stayed quiet. No interruption, no judgment. Only the soft scrape of knife on wood returned steady and patient, reminding her she wasn't speaking to the empty air. Someone was truly listening. The embers cracked shadows, rising and falling along the cabin walls. Joda drew another breath, her voice fragile. The baby's father. He was the son of a preacher. He had a handsome face, honey on his tongue. He told me I was a blessing sent from God, and I believed him. I truly believed. Her arms tightened around the infant, then she gave a bitter laugh. When I told him the truth, he said I'd imagined it, said I had tempted him. I begged, but he turned his back. And his father, the preacher, he looked at me as though I were possessed by the devil. In a single night, I went from being the town's daughter to something no one would even greet on the street. Wind pressed against the roof, its howl like cruel laughter. Joda shuddered, each word cutting her deeper. They took my name. They took my family. They took away the belief that I was worth loving. So I left, and I didn't look back. At last, Nolan lifted his eyes, the firelight flickering in their dark depths. He laid the half-carved wood aside, the knife, resting flat across his thigh, his hands closing around it. He let her grief stand unbroken, without rushing to soothe it or cover it with hollow comfort. The cabin air grew heavy with silence. Then Nolan rose, added wood to the hearth, and the flames leapt bright again, casting light over the tears on Joda's cheeks. She turned toward him, hesitant. "You don't ask. Don't ask if I regret it, if I deserved it." His reply came slow, steady. "No need to ask. You carried your child through the storm, through the cold. That tells me more than any answer could." Her sobs shook loose. Tears streamed freely now, not the scorn tears of shame, but the tears of someone finally believed. Nalin didn't step closer. He simply stood a few feet away, his quiet presence wrapping around her like a cloak. Outside, the storm eased. Inside, the cabin held them like a fortress, keeping the woman and her child safe from the world beyond. For the first time, Joda saw that the stranger in this room wasn't danger at all, but the only safety she had left. The night wore on. Fern slept deeply, lips parted, cheeks pink in the firelight. Joda lay, curled, her eyes still open in the glow. By the door, Nalin sat straight, his revolver across his knees, his gaze on the dark like a wolf keeping watch. Her voice drifted softly across the room. "Don't you think I'm to blame? A woman wandering into the woods alone, heavy with child? People called me foolish, mad." Nalin turned his head. His voice was hoarse but steady as stone. "People talk plenty. I see a mother. And any mother who carries her child through storm and rain without turning back could never be to blame." Joda's eyes lingered on his broad back, the shape of his shoulders guarding her, though they didn't belong to her. More tears slid down, but this time they came with release, like setting down a weight she had carried too long. Toward dawn, the fire burned low, only red coals glowing. Joda drifted in and out of sleep. A rustle stirred her awake. Nalin was laying an old hide gently over her and the baby. Cold wind seeped through the door frame, but inside the blanket she felt warm. Her voice came thin, broken. "Nalin." He paused, waiting. "If one day I can stand again, I won't forget this night. I won't forget the man who sat by the fire and listened to me cry." Nalin's mouth curved into the faintest fleeting smile. "Just see you and the child through this winter. The rest we'll face when it comes." Joda closed her eyes, and in her chest, a tender shoot of faith began to grow that not everyone would turn away, that someone, at least for this night, had chosen to stay. Outside, the first light of dawn touched the horizon with pale rose. The cabin still leaned and groaned, but inside, a woman, a child, and a lone cowboy had found one more reason to endure. Part 4. A Promise by the Fire. The storm had passed, leaving only the wind whispering through the cracks of the roof. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled, throwing light across smoke-stained walls. Joda sat close to the hearth arms, wrapped around Fern, her shoulders trembling. The flames revealed her thin face, the dark hollows beneath her tired eyes. Nalin sat opposite his shadow, stretching long across the dirt floor. In his rough hands, he turned a piece of wood beneath a small knife, not for purpose, only to keep himself awake. The steel caught the glow of the coals, yet his gaze stayed softer, more fixed on the fire than the blade. The silence between them grew heavy, as if the cabin held not just the storm's memory, but all the unspoken things they carried. Joda pressed her lips tight. Then suddenly, her voice cracked out of her like something torn free. "I don't know what I'm doing." The sound broke into the room like a confession, a door flung open to let all her fear rush out. Nalin lifted his head. Firelight deepened in his eyes, steady as the stone of Montana. Without hesitation, he answered, quiet but clear, "I do." Joda's eyes brimmed. 2 words, too short, too plain, but in the small cabin, they struck like a vow. She trembled, her voice testing him. "What do you know of me? You don't know where I'll go or how long I'll last." Nalin set the knife aside and leaned forward. "I know I kept the roof from leaking on you. I know your baby's breathing steady in your arms. And I know this right now. I want to be here. Her breath hitched. So many times she had begged for someone to believe her, only to be cast out. Yet here was a stranger, and 2 words from his lips had cut through all her fear. The fire leapt higher, brightening his hand as he reached out. Scarred knuckles, rope-burnt calluses, fingers shaped by reins and fence posts. But when they came to rest on her shoulder, they were steady, gentle. "You're not alone," he said slowly. "I raised my sister when our parents died. I know how to keep a child alive, how to build a roof, split wood, cook food. You don't know. That's all right. I do." Tears slipped down her face, wetting Fern's hair. Her voice broke. "I stopped believing anyone would stay. Then start believing again," Nalin murmured. In that moment, every wound of exile and rejection seemed to be stitched by the cowboy's hand, not with fancy words, but with his presence, with a promise that didn't need swearing. The night deepened. Outside, wind groaned through the pines, but inside the cabin, the fire burned stronger. Joda laid Fern onto a bed of hides, then sat nearer to Nalin. The distance between them closed without force, without shame. Her whisper trembled. "I'm afraid one day you'll leave too, like all the others." Nalin held her gaze. "People leave. That's their way. But I'm not people. I only know how to stay where I'm needed." She let out a broken laugh through tears. "That's all you'll promise?" He shook his head. "Promises are cheap. The only thing I can do is be here, with you, with the child, one day at a time." And in that moment, the fire warmed more than their bodies. It warmed the coldest parts of their hearts. A promise wasn't written nor spoken in long words, but lit in the eyes of a cowboy and sealed in silence. When dawn came, light crept through a crack in the roof, falling across Joda's face. She sat by the hearth fern asleep in her arms. Beside her, Nalin had dozed off against the post, his hand still resting near his gun. Joda watched him a long while, and she realized the old fear of being abandoned no longer screamed inside her. It had gone quiet like snow, melting under weak morning sun. She whispered softly, almost as a vow returned, "If you're still here in the morning, then I'll believe." Nalin's eyes opened, caught hers, and he gave a single firm nod. That was all, but it was enough. The old fear was gone, and in its place, a fragile new faith began to grow. Outside, the first bird of the forest greeted the day. The cabin still leaned and groaned with age, but inside, a promise had been carved into 2 hearts. Part 5. The cradle carved with a name. That morning, the sky cleared after a night of howling wind. Dew lay heavy on the grass, shining like a dusting of salt. Nalin stepped outside with an axe, his boots pressing into earth, still soft from the rain. His dark bay horse stood tied under the eaves, steam curling white from its breath. Behind the cabin leaned the remains of an old trapper's shed, its gray timbers canted like the bones of a fish. From there, he pulled what boards were sound. Pine long dried its resin scent, faint like the memory of a forest. He stacked the boards measured with nothing but rawhide cord, and the marks on his boots then scratched a rough curve with his knife the shape of a cradle. No one had told him to. He had no tools but a dull axe and patience forged in long seasons of driving cattle across the plains. When the first board split free along the curve, the crisp crack of wood rang sharp and clean like a promise. Joda stood in the doorway, Fern pressed close against her breast. The wind lifted her dress, but her eyes stayed fixed on him. What? What are you making? The words drifted soft as if afraid to disturb what was coming into being. A bed for the child, Nalin said, never lifting his head. His shoulders moved with steady rhythm, each strike like the beat of a heart. Joda bit her lip. For so long, everything around her had been temporary doors slammed shut, words turned sour, glances turned away. But now, something was being shaped for Fern, something meant to last. Her voice cracked as she whispered, What if tomorrow you're gone? Nalin stopped, wiped his brow with a sun-darkened hand. He didn't look to the trees or the sky. He looked at the curve of pine beneath his knife. Tomorrow isn't here yet. Today, we make the cradle. In the harsh country of the West, promises were often as brief as a bullet's flight. But here, a different kind of vow took shape, the sure swing of an axe, the careful measure of cord, the making of a thing meant to outlast winter. Joda drew Fern tighter and felt a small warmth stir in her chest. Inside, Nalin worked with his knife, shaving thin curls of wood that fell like ribbons of cinnamon bark. He turned each piece to the light of the window, listening to the grain cutting no more than was needed. Rawhide served as clamps, the kind of tools only wealthier townsfolk might own in steel. Joda laid Fern on a folded hide near the fire, the baby's lips pursed like a tiny leaf in sleep. She crouched beside Nalin, lifting one curved board. Heavy, she asked. He nudged it toward her. Feel it. The wood was warm, smooth, still breathing faintly of the forest. Her fingers traced the curve, catching rough places where his knife had yet to pass. She'll sleep here. The words slipped out like something half miraculous. A smile startled her lips, and she covered them quickly, as though happiness were a secret not meant to be seen. Nalin fitted the sides together, boring holes with a hand gimlet pegging them with willow dowels. The timbers creaked, and Joda's breath caught. Will it break? No, he said, tapping the joints. It's only remembering where it came from. He set the base in place, resin scent rising sharp as he split the slats. The cabin seemed brighter, though the day outside was dim. As he worked, he hummed soft broken notes like dust trailing a railroad track. Joda's eyes stung. You used to hold your sister like this, didn't you? Yes. He pared another strip thin, and when she slept, I made things for morning. A latch, a water dipper, sometimes just mended her shoes. That was the West's kind of romance, not in vows, but in small, steady things. A latch, a mended boot, the even stroke of a blade. Joda pressed the board back into his hands, as though by touching it, she too had joined in making a life not yet named. By late afternoon, he fitted the curved rockers using twine as a gauge. When he tested the frame, it swayed and settled, groaning softly before holding firm. Joda lifted a curled shaving, pressed it to her lip like a cat's whisker, and held it up to Fern. The baby stirred, gave a tiny chirp of sound. Joda laughed light, quick, almost shy. She likes it, she whispered. Nalin shaped the rockers, testing their balance. Hear that? The wood will wake me before her cries do. Joda watched his shoulders bend and rise, and felt a skin of safety thicken around the cabin. Then she spoke quickly, before the courage slipped away. As a child, I never had a cradle. We slept on the floor. No one ever wrote my name anywhere. No one thought I was something worth carving into wood. Nalin stood, set down his mallet, and looked at her long enough that her words did not fall into emptiness. Wood takes carving best after it's weathered a few seasons. People are the same. Today, this cradle's had a season of its own. Far off, a train whistle threaded the dusk thin as a strand of wire. The world beyond the towns, the saloons, the faces kept moving. But here something was being made to stay. Joda placed her palm on the frame. Cool, solid, lasting. She didn't dare say thank you a word, too fragile, too easily broken. She only nodded, small but certain. And Nalin answered with a nod of his own, fluent in that quiet language. That night, firelight circled the cabin's rafters. Fern slept on a folded coat, while Joda wiped each board with the hem of her dress. Nalin sat by the table, knife in hand, and began to carve. Not on the rails, not where the eye would boast. He turned the base up and cut into the hidden flat. The knife traced its first uncertain line, then grew steady. 4 letters. Beside them, a single fern leaf, plain and small. Fern. With each stroke, he blew away the dust, his eyes heavy with a responsibility no one had asked of him. Joda looked up when the sound stopped. She crossed to him, knelt, and touched the carving. Her fingers followed. The letters lingered on the thin vein of the leaf. Her throat closed. You... Nalin laid the knife down, both hands open on his knees, the posture of a man ready to be held accountable. If you don't like it, I'll smooth it out. I carved it because I thought her name ought to have a home. She shook her head, too fast, tears running clean down her cheeks. No one ever did anything like this for her. No one ever spoke her name this way. He didn't answer with pride or modesty. He only rubbed deer tallow into the cut, darkening the grain, sealing it, like a secret kept safe. In the old tales of the West, folks remembered the gunshots, the jingle of spurs on saloon planks, the sharp standoff at high noon. But deeper than all that were the quieter moments, a man carving a child's name, not his own, on the underside of a cradle, polishing the wood as if smoothing away an old wound. Joda bent low, pressed her lips to the carved name. Her voice was barely a breath. This is her home. By morning, the sky lay pale as tin clouds, thin as paper drifting over. Nalin set the final pegs, tested the rockers. The cradle swayed gently, its rhythm like the beat of a heart. He bent a strip of wood over the fire, curved it for a guardrail, bound it with leather thongs. At last, he rubbed more tallow until the surface glowed like amber. Joda had washed the old cloth and laid it out to dry at dawn. She folded it thin for bedding, her hands trembling as she lifted Fern as though handing over part of her own heart. "Sleep easy, little one," she whispered. "This man hears your cry even before your mother does." Nalin stepped back, leaving space. Joda laid her daughter down, tucking the cloth close, brushing a finger over the baby's cheek. Fern stretched, sighed, and settled. Nalin set the cradle, rocking its soft rhythm, carrying like a lullaby. Joda sat beside it, eyes fixed on her child. Back in Helena, they told me not to name her, not to weave, not to dream. They said she had no place. But now she does. Nalin nodded. She has a place. She has a name. She has someone at the door. His arm rested on his knee, eyes level with the cradle's edge. No more words were needed. Everything was already written in the carved letters below, in the cradle's steady sway, in the fire's glow, still warm on the wall. Outside, the horse snorted, the tack creaked. Far away, the railroad line cut the land like a scar. But inside this cabin, a wound had begun to close. Fatherhood didn't need blood. It needed a cradle's strong hands and a man willing to stay. Joda laid her hand on the cradle's rim, then lifted her gaze to Nalin, her eyes no longer guarded. "If tomorrow comes," she said softly, "I want tomorrow to look like today." Nalin made no promise, no oath. He only set the cradle rocking again, as though nodding toward a new season of life. And if love is nothing more than staying and giving a name to what is most fragile, then tell me, what would you name today? Part 6. The Old Silver Ring, Winter Morning. Snow patched the ground, the sun still low, its pale light catching on bare branches. Nalin left the cabin with rifle and knife, leaving Joda and Fern in the warmth behind. He followed game tracks through the timber gone until the shadows leaned long. By evening, he returned, shoulders dusted with snow, a rabbit tied across his saddle. But in his hand, he carried something else, a small, weathered leather pouch. Found it under a fallen pine, he said, setting it on the table. The cord crumbled as he untied it, spilling out a few tarnished silver coins, a plain ring with no stone and fragments of old bone. Joda lifted the ring. The silver was dulled, scratched, but its circle was whole. Too simple to tempt a thief, yet its plainness made her hand tremble. "Who buried it here?" she whispered. Nalin sat near the fire, its glow painting his cheek. Could have been a trapper. Could have been a woman passing through these woods, needing to hide what she could no longer carry. Joda turned the ring between her fingers, the chill of it seeping to her heart. A small circle of metal, yet once it may have been a vow, proof of something promised. For years she had lived with doors closing, voices denying, love withheld. Now this silver loop, dug from the earth, had found its way back to her palm. Night deepened. Wind howled across the roof, but inside the cabin, Fern slept in her cradle, soft breath rising. Joda sat close to the fire, her eyes fixed on the silver band. Nalin rested opposite, back against a post, gaze calm and steady. "Do you think I should keep it?" she asked, her voice unsteady. Nalin nodded slowly. "It found you, not the other way around. Maybe it's been waiting for the right hands to give it new meaning." Joda gave a thin smile, bitter at the edges. "I've nothing worth a ring. Only a past no one wanted." Nalin shifted closer, the firelight catching in his eyes, deep and unwavering. His words came slow, carved like stone. "Joda, I want to do more than light fires and mend roofs. I want to stand beside you. I want to raise Fern as my own child. And I want to put this ring on your hand. Not as something left behind, but as a promise from me. I want to raise Fern as our own." Her tears came hot and fast. No flowery speeches, no fancy words, only a truth that struck hard as a hammer driving into timber. "Why me?" she whispered. "Because I see you," he said without pause. "And I choose to stay." Joda slid the ring onto her finger. It was loose, slipping, as if afraid to belong. She studied it in the firelight, scratches gleaming like tiny stars. "It doesn't fit," she murmured, almost as an excuse. Nalin took it back, turning it in his palm, then smiled faintly. "Fit doesn't matter. What matters is it rests here tonight on your hand." He slipped it onto her finger again with a motion as steady as patching a roof or tending a fire. To him it was simple, but her heart pounded so fierce she could scarcely breathe. She looked at her hand, once pushed away, once left, knocking on doors that never opened. Now that same hand bore a circle of silver, old but warm. Not the sign of someone who had left her behind, but of someone choosing to remain for the winter, for a lifetime. In the little cabin, wind keened against the walls, but the silence inside was filled with a vow. Morning light slid through the cracks in the planks. Joda sat on the stoop, Fern sleeping in a sling at her chest, her fingers turning the ring unconsciously. It no longer felt cold. The metal held the warmth of her blood now. Nalin split wood in the yard, each strike of the axe ringing in the quiet forest. With every blow, she heard his words again. I want to raise Fern as our own. It beat like a second heartbeat in her chest. She looked to the far timberline where the railroad cut the land, reminding her of all the other paths a man might take. Her breath caught. If you go on to Bozeman, you'll have work money, an easier life. Nolan rested the axe upright, leaning on the haft. Easier don't mean truer. I've roamed Texas, Wyoming. I know when it's time to stop, and I know where I belong. Joda swallowed unsure, but inside her heart, a decision stirred to try trusting again. Not for the ring, not for fine words, but for the rough hands that had chosen to remain. That night, the fire sang once more. Joda sat close to Nolan, no longer holding herself apart. Fern slept in the cradle carved with her name, her tiny fist curled around her own secret. Joda gazed at the ring on her finger and whispered, I don't know what love is supposed to be, but if it feels like today, then I think I want to believe. Nolan turned his calloused hand covering hers, silver band warm between them. No need to call it anything. Just stay. Joda laid her head on his shoulder. Eyes, wet lips curved in the smallest smile. She had heard 100 false promises in her life, but tonight, in a leaning cabin under Montana snow, a quiet cowboy had given her reason to believe again. Outside, snow fell soft, laying a white cloak over the roof. Inside, firelight and an old silver ring had changed the course of 2 lives. Part 7. A wedding in the snow. That morning, the Montana sky was hard and silver as steel. Snow fell in light drifting flakes, cloaking the cabin and smoothing the path in white. The wind whispered through the pines, not fierce, only cold enough to bite to the bone. Joda stood in the doorway with Fern in her arms, watching the flakes settle. The baby stirred her tiny fingers, curling against her mother's hand, as if to reach for the falling white. Nolan came from the horse shed arms, heavy with firewood. Snow clung to his shoulders, his breath trailing white into the air. Stepping inside, he paused. There in the doorway, Joda and Fern gazed at the snow together, and his heart beat hard against his chest. In the quiet, Joda turned to him, her voice almost a whisper. This day, we can call it a beginning. Nolan set the wood down, pulled off his gloves, and stepped closer. He wasn't a man for fine words, but the weight of his hand resting on her shoulder was enough to seal it. Then let's begin now, he said. We don't need to wait on anyone else. By the fire, Joda laid Fern in her cradle. Nolan drew out the old silver ring they'd found days before, polishing it against a strip of hide. The silver, worn and darkened, still caught the flicker of flame. And for me, he said, pulling another band from his pocket. It was carved from pine, its small cracks singed and sealed with deer tallow. I whittled this last night. It isn't silver, it isn't bright, but it's mine, and I want it to be ours. Joda's hand trembled as she took it. Light as a breath, heavy as meaning itself. Most folks wear rings to show the world, but you kept this hidden in your pocket all night. Nolan smiled faintly. Because no one needs to see it but us. 2 rings. One old and tarnished one. New and carved from wood. Together, they told the whole story. Something once cast aside and something newly chosen. By noon, the air stilled. Snow kept falling fine as powder. Nolan and Joda stepped into the open clearing before the cabin boots crunching through the white. Fern was wrapped snug against Joda's chest, her cheeks pink, wide eyes watching as though she were the only witness needed. No preacher, no guests, only the towering pines like a vaulted roof, and the Montana sky itself as witness. Nolan took Joda's hand, his calloused palm closing firm over hers. His voice was low, but sure as an axe splitting wood. We don't have holy books nor choirs, but we have this land. We have the fire inside that cabin. We have the child asleep between us. I promise to stand with you through winter or summer hunger or plenty. Joda's eyes glistened. The wind tugged her hair, her lips quivering. She answered, I have little to give, only this heart, only these hands. But I give them to you, and to the home we will build with them. In the silence of the woods, their vows rang truer than any church bell. Nalan slid the silver ring onto her finger. Cold at first, it warmed instantly against her skin. Joda placed the wooden band on his hand, the rough circle resting against scarred knuckles. To him, it was dearer than all the gold he'd ever seen in a town window. They stood long eyes locked. Snow kissed their hair, their shoulders melting into drops. Then Joda rose on her toes and pressed her lips to his. It was no hurried kiss, no firestorm, just deep and quiet like rain sinking into thirsty earth. Fern shifted in her sling, a soft murmur escaping her. Joda laughed through tears, and Nalan's arm tightened around her. The West had seen its share of gunfights, sudden deaths, saloons brimming with noise. But here, it bore witness to something rarer. A love plain and unadorned, yet sacred as the first snow. By evening, the sun glowed red through the mountains like embers fading low. The cabin stood still, a ribbon of smoke rising from its chimney. On the stoop sat Joda Nalan and Fern, 3 souls, 3 breaths, 1 shelter. Joda turned the silver ring in the last light, its surface flashing faintly. Nalan twisted the pine band on his own hand, as though turning his whole life into a circle. They needed no paper, no courthouse, no witness, but the land itself. Their vows, spoken in snow and silence, were written deeper than any seal of town or church. Do you think anyone will believe us? Joda asked softly. Nalan's gaze stayed on the horizon. We don't need them to believe. We only need us, and this child. Fern yawned, a tiny sound like a blessing. Joda rested her head on Nalan's shoulder, eyes, closing lips, whispering, Then today is our wedding day. Snow kept falling, each flake glittering in the dusk. The land itself bore witness, and that was enough to make the vow eternal. Part 8. A Home Rebuilt. The snow melted slow, like a long sleep breaking. By morning, steam rose off the dark ground, carrying the scent of moss and rotted leaves, a warm greeting from the earth itself. Out in front of the cabin, Nalan marked lines in the damp soil with the charred end of a stick, a furrow running north to south, a pit of ash for fertilizer, a drainage trench to keep the ground from drowning. His boots pressed 2 dark rows into the soft earth, while the tack hanging from the porch post creaked faintly in the wind. Joda stepped outside with Fern in her arms, tilting the child's cheek toward the sunlight. You're heavier now, she whispered, as if confessing it to herself. In her free hand, she held the scrap of paper Nalan had sketched the garden plan. Symbols dotted its surface, 3 circles, for corn-slanted lines, for beans, a wide ring for squash. Why 3 together? She asked. Nalan squinted into the light. Crow Man showed me once when I was 17 on the cattle trail. 3 sisters, he called it. Corn stands tall, beans climb the stalk, squash spreads wide to keep the ground moist. They live better close than apart. His voice carried the weight of a borrowed tradition, low and respectful. Joda nodded. If some things live better together, then we try. She laid Fern down on Nolan's folded coat and knelt in the dirt. Her hands cracked from winter closed around the damp soil, each handful solid warm. They worked with few words. Nolan cut furrows with a short hoe. Joda followed, clearing roots, pulling bits of old wood left by storms. The bay horse stood steaming at the porch, a quiet sentinel. From the edge of the woods came the tentative call of the first spring birds. By midday, sweat mixed with earth on their collars. Nolan leaned on his hoe, proud of furrows straight as rails. Joda spread her palms. Soil clung to every whirl of her fingerprints, as though the land itself had stamped its covenant upon her. She smiled, small, fragile, but enough to brighten her eyes. It was the first morning after winter, when they both dared call the same place home. Not with papers nor church bells, but with dirt beneath fingernails and a child asleep under spring sun. They planted in rhythm. Nolan dropped pale kernels of corn into shallow holes, each spaced by the length of his stride. Joda followed, setting 2 beans by every stalk, then pressing squash seeds along the edge. "I've never planted anything," she said, her laugh dry, "except words in the wrong people." Nolan pressed his palm flat to the earth, patting it down like a friend's shoulder. Soil doesn't remember who scorned it. It only remembers who came back patient. Wind shifted, carrying pine resin through the clearing. Joda closed her eyes a moment. She saw again her sister's door slamming, the whispers of Helena women, the shadow of the church at the street's end. Then she opened her eyes to see new earth covered like a brown quilt. Maybe hearts are the same. Touch them, and they hurt, but leave them long enough they go hollow. Fern stirred. Joda lifted her, pressing the child's hand into the soil. Nolan chuckled, rare and soft. Frontier baptism. When the last ash was spread, Joda drew 3 ribbons from her cloth pouch fragments she had saved when there was nothing else worth keeping. She tied one at the head of the furrow, one in the middle, one at the end. "So I'll know the way back if I get lost," she said. Nolan's eyes followed the fabric stirring in the breeze. Markers for the season. He glanced at the clouds. "If rain comes early, I'll cut another trench." They sank together on the split porch step, quiet with fatigue. No thanks spoken. Instead, lunch was thin corn gruel scraped from the last of their stores. Joda filled a wooden spoon, passed it to Nolan. Their eyes met over smoke and steam, the look itself a treaty signed. Afternoon stretched with hammer and knife. Nayland climbed the roof, replacing rotten boards with planks salvaged from the old shed. Each nailed strip made the wind whistle a little less. Joda mixed wet moss with clay, packing it into the cabin walls. The damp smell clung to her wrists, leaving green bands like children's arms wrapping tight. "Mind your hands," Nayland called down voice, carrying without force. "Clay's slick." "You mind yours," Joda shot back, just as he drove a splinter into his palm. He bit down silent, but when he moved to keep working, she stood at the ladder's base, a rare command in her tone. "Down." He obeyed. At the doorway, she boiled water, tore strips from her old dress, set out a coarse needle. Taking his hand in hers, she said, "Give it here." The needle pierced skin. Nolan closed his eyes, not for pain, but for something else, the strange tightening in his chest at being cared for. "You do everything," steady, Joda murmured as she tied the bandage, "even getting hurt." "Steady's the only way I know," he said, afraid his voice might break the moment. She blew lightly across the stitched wound. Nolan chuckled, eyes warming. A small wound, nothing by frontier measure, but it carried meaning. Neither spoke aloud. "I'll tend to you," I'll let you tend to me. By dusk, the roof was tighter, the walls sealed. Joda hung washed cloths on the line as carefully as if hanging a whole season. Fern slept, hand-clutching air. Days passed stitched into rhythm, sunrise, fetch water, wind split wood, noon beans reheated, evening checked the furrows. Each task had its sound saw, teeth grating like a low hymn knife shaving wood, like Day's peeled thin spoon, tapping against pot like prayer. Nalin built her a chair with a curved back smooth as riverstone. Joda ran her hand along the seat and smiled. I'll sit here with Fern. And you? By the door, Nalin answered, eyes smiling. So, I'll hear what I need to before it troubles you. She taught him in return how to hem cloth, how to hide the last stitch so it wouldn't scratch the skin. He fumbled, laughed for the first time, long and free. One noon, sunlight slanting across the floor, Fern laughed a small bell-like sound, her very first. Joda froze, then tears burst forth. Nalin set down his bowl, standing rigid as if hearing a bugle call of something holy. They met eyes speechless. That laugh opened a long locked room inside them, the belief that joy might belong to them too. That evening, Nalin fixed a new hook by the hearth, so warmth is always within reach. Joda hung a strip of cloth for drying the baby's things, swaying in pale light. Simplicity itself, yet more trustworthy than any promise. By late spring, rain came heavy as a curtain drawn straight from heaven. Wind battered the pines, the cabin shook. Nalin barred the door, wedged braces. Joda pulled Fern close, moved the cradle to the hearth. Smoke and wet wood mingled with the faint scent of leaves aflame. It was the test of all they'd built. Did water seep past the new boards? No. Did the roof moan like before less? Did cold air slip through the walls? The moss held it out, green and firm. For hours the storm hammered. Joda sat in her new chair, Fern asleep, tiny hand curled on the blanket. Nalin sat by the door, eyes fixed on the roofline. Each time wind roared, he glanced at her. Each time the fire fell, she fed it. They worked by looks, by steps, by the scrape of wood on the floor. Near midnight, a crack split overhead. Nalin leapt, climbed into the storm, nailed back a shifted board. Joda stood in the doorway, lantern raised high, her flame a beating heart that refused to die. When he dropped down, soaked and laughing through his breath, she pulled him in with a dry cloth. They sat against the wall, hands twined beneath a blanket. The cradle rocked gently nearby, a sign of peace. Rain poured on, but the answer was clear. The house stood. Not because the timber was finest, but because two people had guarded it together. Joda rested her head against his shoulder, her voice soft as wind through a torn hymn. Once I thought happiness was a spell. Today I think it's work done over and over. Nalin's reply was a low hum, an assent deeper than words. They stayed that way until the storm thinned to mist. Morning left the ground jeweled with water. In the garden, green spears of corn pierced upward, beans curled, squash pushed the earth wide like a hand. Joda carried Fern to the porch. The baby blinked at the new light lips, pursed as if tasting something fresh. We have rebuilt, Joda said, not proud, only truthful. Nalin nodded, laying a calloused hand on the doorframe. And tomorrow, we build again. In the silence of the woods, the answer of happiness came clear, not in miracles, but in small repeated acts. A roof mended a seed, sprouting a cradle, rocking a fire, learning to stay. If happiness is a work repeated, what small act would you begin today? Part 9. Laughter instead of silence. It was an early summer morning. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, laying golden patches across the earth before the cabin porch. Inside, the faint scent of corn porridge lingered in the pot. Joda sat in her chair, eyes fixed on Fern, who gripped the rail of her cradle with tiny fists. The child's legs trembled stiff as fragile fence posts. "She's trying," Joda whispered, her voice full of both awe and worry. Nalin stepped in from the porch, the smell of grass and horse still clinging to his coat. He stopped in his tracks, watching. Fern let go, wobbled and took a single step toward her mother, then dropped squarely onto the floorboards. Joda started forward, but Nalin's look held her back. Let her try. Fern sat still, eyes wide. Then suddenly, she laughed. A clear, ringing laugh that filled the cabin like a tiny church bell. Joda and Nalin burst out laughing with her, their voices rising to mingle with the wind and the sound of hooves shifting outside. Covering her mouth, Joda's eyes brimmed. "For the first time in my life, I think even a fall can be beautiful." From that day on, silence no longer ruled the cabin. Fern stumbled, toddled, toppled, and laughed through it all. Her laughter filled the boards, the rafters, the spaces that once knew only quiet. Joda set up little props, folded blankets, low stools, scraps of timber for Fern to cling to. "She's like a calf, learning to run," Joda said with a smile. Her legs still shake, but her spirit's already ahead. Nalin built a bar across the room for the girl to hold on to. Standing with arms crossed, he watched with steady pride. "Stubborn as her mother," he muttered. Joda flushed, but her smile carried something new, confidence born from what once was weakness. One evening, as the sun sank blood red beyond the ridge, Fern staggered 5 steps straight into her mother's arms. She laughed as she fell against Joda's chest, her tiny hand thumping against her mother's heart. That sound, her laughter mingling with the whisper of pines, lit the whole cabin brighter than fire. One midday, Fern stumbled toward Nalin, who was bent over his knife at the table. Hearing her uneven steps, he lifted his head. His eyes widened. Arms out, Fern toppled straight into his legs. In a heartbeat, he scooped her up, lifting her high and spinning her once. Fern's laughter rang wild, her little hand clutching at the brim of his hat. And Nalin laughed too loud, rare unguarded a sound that rolled through the cabin. Joda pressed a hand to her chest, tears burning at the corners of her eyes. What she felt then was not just relief, but peace. A man not bound by blood, a child born of loneliness, and somehow they belonged to each other now through laughter. "She's chosen you," Joda whispered. Nalin held Fern close, his eyes steady, voice sure. "No. She just reminded me I already chose you both." That night, the wind moaned outside, but the cabin glowed with fire. Fern played with a block of wood, giggling whenever Nalin pretended to drop his wooden knife. Joda sat back, her smile longer, freer than she'd ever known. Helena returned to her mind, her sister's cold house, the whispers in the streets, the silence that had been her punishment. Back then, silence meant exile. Now, silence was gone, broken apart by laughter. She turned to Nalin, her voice hushed. "Do you know? Her laughter fills every space I thought would stay empty forever." Nalin nodded, his voice like low timber. "Then let her keep laughing, and we'll keep listening." Their eyes met, and Joda realized silence had once been a shackle. Now, it had been shattered by the purest sound on earth. Summer deepened. Outside the cabin, their garden flourished. Corn stood tall, beans climbed, squash spread its wide leaves. Between the rows, toddled Fern, her feet muddy laughter bubbling like a stream. Joda followed, wiping sweat from her brow. laughing too. From the porch, Nalin squinted into the sun, pride rising in him like heat off the ground. Fern tripped hard face in the dirt, hands filthy. But she laughed again, bright and fearless. Joda scooped her up, kissing a dusty cheek, tears in her eyes, smile on her lips. You're like the cornstalk falling then rising again. Nalin stepped forward, his arms circling both mother and child. 3 breaths joined as one. The west was still harsh, but inside this small cabin, laughter rang like a hymn. Silence had once ruled here. Now it was banished. And in its place, Joda and Nalin knew this truth. Happiness wasn't forged in grand things, but in the clear, simple sound of a child learning to walk. Do you believe a child's laughter could turn a fragile cabin into a lasting heaven? Part 10. Choosing to Stay. Autumn returned in the sound of dry leaves crunching under boots and the sweet scent of ripened corn drifting on the wind. In front of the cabin, the 3 sisters stood shoulder to shoulder, corn rising tall like flagpole's beans, curling their green arms, tight around the stalks, squash sprawling wide at their feet, leaves broad as hands sheltering the soil. One afternoon, a salt wagon rattled past its driver, trading a few yellow squash for grain. Before leaving, he handed Joda a wrinkled letter edges smeared with mud. Found this snagged in the barbed wire near the tracks, he said. It's got your name on it. The handwriting, her sister's proud hand from years ago, cut across the page, brittle as dried grass. If you wish to come home, there is room beneath this roof, as long as you leave the child behind to be raised proper. The word home bore down heavy. The words raised proper struck sharp as a blade. Joda read it once, then again. Her eyes no longer shook, but carried the weariness of a long road walked. Nalin stood on the porch, with a hammer watching, but not intruding. He said only one line, slow and steady, as driving a stake. If you want to ride back to Helena, I'll saddle the horse this moment. If you don't, I'll build the fire tonight, and tomorrow we'll lay the corn to dry. The wind tugged her coat, whispering memories of church halls, stone-cold walls, eyes like granite. Joda looked up, and suddenly the small cabin gleamed, the wooden cradle carved with fern, the chair Nalin had built, 3 iron hooks for her pots, Fern's muddy handprint still drying across the boards. She folded the letter, laid it on the table, where Nalin's knife had scarred the wood that first winter. Home isn't the roof, she said, quietly, firmly. Home is the one who stays beneath it. She tied a loose thread around the stem of a fresh-picked ear of corn, like tying down a vow. Nalin only nodded, the long breath he'd held finally leaving his chest. That evening, they shelled beans, pulled corn-cut squash. The sound of their knives was a bridge to the land itself. Inside, the letter lay silent no longer, a rope pulling her away, only a dry leaf pressed between pages of time. That night, Nalin built the fire, Joda stirred beans into the pot, and the room filled with warmth. Days later, they rode into town. Dust rose along the road, the desert wind carrying straw scent and the thin cry of a faraway train. The saloon doors creaked, spurs clinked on warped planks, men leaned at the counter with quick glances. The town was the same rusted signs, faded paint sunset, burning red across tin rooftops. Joda lowered her hat-brim hand on Fern's sling. Nalin walked beside her steady stride, one hand resting at his holster, not to threaten, only the way a man of the West carried the weight of what he'd protect. The mercantile smelled of molasses. The shopkeeper unrolled a bolt of calico, tiny flowers scattered across it. Joda's fingers brushed them gently, like touching a childhood she never had. Behind her came a murmur. "That's the girl from Helena, ain't it?" Another voice. "Look, she's wearing a ring." But no laughter followed. Just words empty now, without weight. She traded cornmeal for salt needles thread and a pinch of brown sugar. Nalin paid with the coins earned from chopping wood. When they stepped outside, sunlight poured over them. Joda tore the cloth into 3 ribbons, one tied to Fern's cradle, one around her own wrist, and one quietly onto the strap of Nalin's saddle. "So we'll always know the way back," she said, smiling. The town fell behind them, whispers trailing off like dust. At the forest's edge, Joda looked up. The cabin roof, patched with fresh boards, shone in the light like a strip of tin. "Once, silence was a punishment," she said. "Now silence is where I can hear us." Nalin smiled, loosening the reins. They rode beneath the pines into a different kind of cathedral, the wind singing hymns through branches, woodpeckers beating their drums, sunlight breaking into golden dust. Happiness was tested not just in calm, but in trial. One night, Fern burned with fever, breath quick as a young leaf in hot wind. Joda pressed cool cloths to her forehead, hands trembling but steady. Nalin stoked the fire low, kept warmth without stifling, opened the door to let night air drift through. He set a basin by the cradle, dimmed the lantern. The long night stretched. Joda whispered words without name, a rhythm of prayer not bound to any church. "Stay, stay, stay." Nalin sat by the door, ears sharp to every breath. When Fern whimpered, he fetched water-change cloths. At midnight, he took his knife and carved a tiny fern leaf into the doorframe. "So we'll remember this night," he murmured, not only to the wood, but to his own heart. Joda touched the grooves, feeling them like a story etched in flesh. By the last watch, Fern's fever broke. Her breaths grew, even her hair damp with sweat fine as corn silk. Joda sagged with relief, tears falling into a smile. Nalin draped his coat over her shoulders, hands still resting at the door. "You stayed," she whispered, voice trembling as though afraid to stir something holy. "I did," he answered, not with pride, only as fact worn smooth by repetition. Dawn came. Birds called. Joda laid Fern in her cradle and traced the new carving on the doorframe. She understood then a home is not walls, but someone who tends the fever carves a leaf to remember the night survived. By spring, they added a small room to the north wall shielded from wind. Nalin cut trees, squared beams, joined them with pegs. Joda packed moss and clay into the seams. Each corner rose like a squash sprout, breaking earth tentative but firm. On the frame, he carved 3 marks, one for the day the posts went up, one for the roof, one for the chair set in the corner, Joda's chair, where she rocked Fern and told stories of the corn pushing green. One afternoon, Joda lifted Nalin's knife from the table, the same knife that had carved the first fern, and scratched letters beneath the edge where no eye would see Joda. Then beside it, Nalin. Finally, a small circle, enclosing a single F. She flushed as she set the knife down. When Nalin came in, she hid her hands like a guilty child. "I put our names somewhere." He understood. He didn't need to look. He laid his palm on the tabletop and held it there. "Then this table will bear more weight now, because it carries 3 names." That evening, they notched marks on the doorway, measuring Fern's height, tiny lines like a bird's footprints claiming its branch. Joda hung a cloth she'd sewn from the town's calico, its small flowers scattering blessings across the hearth. "One day," she said softly, blinking back tears, "if anyone asks me where home is, I'll point to these marks." Nalin said nothing, but the thin smile at his lips was the kind a man wears when his greatest wish has found wood to cling to. At dusk, they set 3 chairs on the porch, a wide one for Nalin, a curved one for Joda, a small one he'd built for Fern, though her feet dangled above the floor. Sunset bled red across the cabin walls, desert wind carrying the thin cry of a train. Fern babbled her first sounds, each like a stone dropped into a well, rippling out through the hearts of her parents. Joda held her hand, staring toward the pines. She thought of the letter, the fevered night the fern carved in the door. Once I thought a home was the place someone allowed me to stay. Now I know it isn't where you're born, but where someone chooses to remain. Nalin reached over his calloused hand, resting on hers across the armrest. He didn't say he would stay. He already had. Fern laughed, her head falling on her mother's shoulder, feet kicking against the wood in a rhythm like far-off drums. Inside, the fire crackled beans and corn steaming sweet. On the wall, the shadows of 3 lives lengthened, then merged. Joda leaned against Nalin's shoulder, her voice low, like a prayer at the hearth. "We will grow old here." "Yeah." He answered, one mark at a time. Stars scattered across the sky like spilled salt. They carried Fern inside, laid her in the cradle carved with her name. She turned, found their warmth, breathed easy. Joda touched the F hidden beneath the wood and felt it like a blessing fulfilled. Outside, a train whistle called tempting with other roads. Inside, the choice cooled like hot iron plunged into water, hard, certain. They had chosen to stay. If staying is its own long journey, how far would you go to keep a roof called home? Before you ride off, tell me, what did this story stir in you? Drop your thoughts in the comments and rate it from 0 to 10. And if you'd like more Wild West stories, told in a quiet, firelit voice, subscribe and ring the bell so you'll never miss the next ride. If you were in the cowboy's boots, would you stay to protect the home or ride off into the wild?